Hi, I'm Jon Atack, and I'm joined once again by my dear friend Rio Harada-Parr. Hello, Rio.
Hello, good to see you as always.
Yeah. What are you going to baffle me with today?
I thought we could think a little bit about technology and the nature that technology has and how it's affected the human condition, and if there's any sort of inherent features to technology itself, or if it's just purely instrumental. I suppose something I thought would be quite interesting to think about. Yeah.
It's true. I mean, without the present technology, we'd be having to have this conversation by writing letters to each other. Imagine that. Imagine how long it would take to have this conversation. But no.
Yes, Twitter would be a lot healthier.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. My partner was yesterday accused of having survivor bias on Twitter for suggesting that it was a good idea to draw every day, or to write every day, or whatever it is you do. And she was accused of having survivor bias for suggesting that people should do this. And it took a little while to kind of decode what that means. And I think what it means is being successful. That how dare you, a successful person, advise people who are unsuccessful and it's like, yeah, you do something, practice makes perfect. Remember that? But
yeah, that's very surreal. You don't have to be, you don't have to even be particularly successful to like practice a craft and stick at it and to work out that that does some good for your life. That's very strange.
So, kick us off with something to kick around, I suppose, or throw around.
Sure. So I mean, obviously, in light of recent political events,
I don't know what
I was thinking about. Yeah, nothing's happened recently politically. It's been so dead. It's like John Major's prime ministership all over again.
Have you seen the Lego Capital Invasion set yet? Somebody's actually done a brilliant satire, but
it is a bit like something out of a television show. More of a comedy, to be honest, because it wasn't a very effective coup. They all went in very strong. They all left through like in an orderly queue. Which was the funny part almost. They all go in like wild animals and they come out.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that if anybody was behind this plotting, that was the most stupid thing to do, to warn everybody that they needed 25,000 National Guardsmen in Washington. It really wasn't very clever, but we'll see. But
opposite of the Soviet
creatively, technology that we have, Photoshop, and somebody could take a Lego box and create these characters and make something that looks like a genuine Lego box, which hopefully will sell for hundreds of thousands in the original as a work of, if you can tape a banana to the wall, heck, sorry, I'm being disruptive as usual.
No,
technology.
Okay. It's not particularly disruptive. It's conversation.
Yes, good for you.
Need more of it, not less. Yeah. The only issue with the Lego set idea would be actually no. I was about to say it would be very easy to put it together in your own house with the right Lego pieces, but then that sort of also applies to the banana on the wall.
Yeah, and you don't have to pay $150,000 for the banana and renew the banana and the tape every 4 days for the rest of your life.
Yeah, the Lego stays. It's actually it doesn't. Well, I mean, it doesn't rot. I'm not pretty sure Lego will never rot.
No, it's one of the things that they find in the stomachs of whales, probably. Down at the bottom of the ocean, all the whales packed up with Lego pieces. Yeah. Oh, what a world we live in.
You get swallowed by a whale and you go. Yeah, you get swallowed by a whale, you go into the stomach and there's just a lot of Legos. So you go, that's not actually that bad down here.
Keeps you busy, yeah. Jonah and the Lego.
Yeah. Anyway, it was, but yeah, in light of recent political events, I was thinking, what's sort of incubated a lot of this, and it's very clear that the modern political movements we see are very much formed online and exported off the internet into the real world. I think this is something that, like, especially the mainstream was slow to wake up to, but sort of in the last few years, I feel become very self-evident almost. That the rise of someone like Trump has been very much precipitated online, and when all the events were going down, being a politically engaged citizen, not of America, I was paying attention on Twitter to what was coming out. So, you know, people going, this is terrible, this is awful. You've got people who are going far too extreme and saying, this is, well, I mean, it wasn't far too extreme, but it was more like they were making it out to be like American democracy was genuinely about to fall. It's like, you know, 1917 all over again in Russia or something, though it wasn't a democracy. And then on the other side, you had sort of people defending these people, immediately coming out with claims that all the people who were at the Capitol Hill protests were anti-fascists, Antifa mobs,
stooges,
with terrible evidence. You know, some of the stuff that the most embarrassing evidence that I've ever seen, because it was just desperate. You know, they took a picture of someone, they found that they found on a Google page, it was all said Portsmouth Antifa or something like that alongside it, and they went, see, that's proof that they're mobile Antifa. And so if you actually go on the website, and that's actually their list of known white nationalists. You know, very poor. Yeah.
And part of the whole construction that's going on that we seem to, you know, we seem to have moved into a fantasy world that exists only on the internet, and people are kind of digging into that. A friend of mine wrote me an email the other day, and that I haven't read it because the headline is more proof that COVID-19 is a fake. And I heard somebody from the NHS saying, look, I really wish they'd stop saying this and can look at what we're having to deal with every day. Whatever it is not a fake. It is happening, you know. But the echo chamber, the little bubble that people move into, and that's highly relevant, isn't it, to all of culture, because culture is always a kind of bubble that people inhabit. So in the Middle Ages, people believed that there were dog-headed people, there were mermaids, there were all of these things. And that it was believed, you know, for centuries, that these kind of nonsense ideas. Then you look at something like the religious construction, and, you know, without wishing to offend anybody who's religious, well, it's actually like Life of Brian when they said, we're sorry that we have offended Christians, we intended to offend people of all religions. But you get a religious construction that says these things are true and you have to believe them. And if you don't believe them, we'll burn you at the stake. You know, people talk about cults these days. They've got no idea what a cult is. You know, go back to the 17th century and have a look at it there. But people will actually inhabit this world believing these things to be true. And these things are always cultural. They're always, to some extent, the fault of artists and creative thinkers, you know, writers, particularly in the question of religion, I think sometimes. Oh, I've just thought of this wonderful story about a whale full of Lego. Let's make that part of the new Bible, you know, and this idea suddenly goes in. And the guy writing it is going, nobody's going to believe this. And centuries later, people are hunting whales to recover the Lego from them, you know, or whatever. It becomes, you know, they start looking for the Ark of the Tabernacle, and, you know, crazy. But we are, Jung said that you know, the horror of our times was that we had no mythology to live in, and everybody around him said, what are you talking about? You know, don't be so stupid, just because you're in the water and can't see it, you know. And we're living in a myth. Conspiracy theory has risen up massively and almost taken the place of religion. I don't think this is anything to do with what you were thinking about, but it stimulated me.
It's interesting. It's interesting. It reminds me of all the books I haven't read yet and all the things I need to read.
Don't tell me about it. The older you get,
all those things.
There are.
God.
You know, when I was 18, I thought I knew, you know, 1% of what there was to be known, and now I know that I don't know 1,000th of 1%. And I'm hoping that pretty soon I won't care. You know, I'll get to the point where it's like, I just can't be bothered.
Yeah,
so
that's got its own dangers, I imagine.
It does. When I was about 17, I read Lao Tzu and decided that the version I read talked about book learning being a really bad thing. And so I stopped reading for several months. And I didn't get any smarter. That was the thing, you know. I haven't anyway. I've read a lot of books since then. I still haven't got any smarter. But it's reading the right books and there are too many of them. There are just too many of, too many extraordinarily important books to read. So I have several friends who tell me they don't read fiction because they don't have time. And I'm sort of going, well, as Somerset Maugham said, if you want to understand psychology, read novels, because these guys have to understand it. Dostoevsky will tell you a lot
the
more
roots,
about it.
Yeah, and obviously, like one of the roots of modern psychology actually started with using Shakespeare characters as examples of psychological studies,
and moves into classical Greek ideas.
Really,
yeah, so we find complex as Electra or Oedipus or what have you. And Freud didn't even read all three of the plays; he only read one of them, so he doesn't really understand the character of Oedipus fully. Yeah, Eric Fromm analyzes it in great detail in Greatness and Limitations in Freud's Thought, which is a wonderful little book, the last book Fromm wrote at the age of 80. And he's basically, Euripides said this, and this, he hasn't understood this. It's like, no, he made it all up, mate. Don't worry with Freud. He just made it all up. It's nonsense. But here we are still talking about it 100 and some years later. So the culture, the culture. Sorry, then
go ahead.
We are a technological culture. We are cyber people, whether we like it or not. Our minds are already have been stolen by Facebook and sold to Cambridge Analytica. That we are now part of something absolutely new and unique. That we are approaching a singularity, perhaps not in artificial intelligence, but perhaps for us, we are. It seems that there's a duality rather than a singularity. There are two camps, and you're going to be in one or the other of them, basically. But where's this thinking taken you? I've diverted from your original thought.
So the thing that worried me, and this is something that I don't think we've seen as much of it before in the past. And I think it's something that unique that social media and technologies have allowed us to do, though this will eventually move outwards. Is that I noticed that it sort of started with my mum debating some of her friends from Japan on Facebook who support Trump.
Yeah,
it's very strange. Japan has a very strong pro-Trump movement, and what was interesting to me was in the past, while obviously there have been fringes, right, of society, and there's always like niches where people don't subscribe to mainstream beliefs, they have their own conspiratorial beliefs.
What used to be called the lunatic fringe.
It appears now that that instead alternate information, we don't share a narrative anymore. Right? When you talk to someone about politics, you have to talk about epistemology first. You have to talk about what is true first. And it's this very surreal thing where you go, well, that's just not true, and then they go, well, yes, it is, and then they go, and you go, supply me some evidence, and then they show you some botched tweet off Twitter, and you go, well, this is wrong because of this, and this, and then you have to deal with, what became apparent very quickly is that the amount of effort one has to go through to have an engagement with someone, a meaningful political engagement with anyone in these areas, is almost so unreasonable to ask that of someone that it becomes very strange to work out whether it's possible or even reasonable to ask people to, which is the very human, very human and very important call, which I still would guard, which is, we should have conversations with people, discuss things with people, because obviously if we don't do this, it's going to get worse. But it's becoming clear that somehow even getting these conversations off the ground in the first place are going to require such effort from ordinary people. But there is a point of not no return, but a point where things get very worrying and solutions have to be thought of beyond. I'm not advocating for any authoritarianism. I'm not saying, we form a revolutionary vanguard and we overthrow the government, and then from there a worker state will arise, because that's a terrible idea. But it does appear that sort of happened, and I think that, frankly, unfortunately, the nature of media technologies have really made this thing a lot worse, which is that not only did they create filter bubbles, right, where everyone just shares information amongst people that agree with them.
Yeah, the echo chamber.
Yeah, which is very prevalent. No matter what you believe in, liberal Democrats have their own echo chamber these days, so they're all getting them. It's not just the radicals.
Absolutely.
Though they disagree. But it appears now that because we can pump out so much information so quickly, and everyone can form an idea so quickly and throw it out onto the internet, which is a good thing in principle, you can now build entire bodies of information completely predicated on no basis of reality, and that can form the basis of someone's worldview. And that was a very scary thought, which is that it's in some ways, for every piece of information you can fact check and verify, there'll be 10 more pieces of information. And I'm not sure if we can really walk back from that point. Do we have to deal with a permanently divided society now, or is there some epistemic sort of authority we form to deal with this problem? Well, that seems very Orwellian in its own way, right? It's creating a ministry of truth that tells people what's because unfortunately, as much as we'd like to trust our governments, we've been shown consistently post-war that you can't trust them on anything, especially when it comes to privacy or foreign policy or political or even political disagreements. And America's been very impressive at that over the last 200 years. People forgetting that America used to be the stronghold of trade unionism and now is completely dead there. But those are just some thoughts, preliminary.
Yeah, I mean, the US, with groups like the Teamsters, the unions themselves became corrupt. The same thing happened in Australian politics at the Labour Party in Australia. I talked with a former Australian senator a couple of years ago who I happened to have met because he'd interviewed me for a PhD he was doing way back. And he remembered me. I didn't remember him. But anyway, after that, he'd become a senator. And he said he'd had to leave government because it was completely corrupt. And there was nothing you could say about it. There was nothing he could do about it. He was just going to go and look after some chickens, and that was it. He wasn't going to speak out anymore because he realized, the web of corruption was such. And I think that is what's happened is that it used to be that you'd have to wait 20 to 50 years until the papers came out and you realized just how bad government had been, and that it seemed to be every government had been bad, that they'd done underhand and despicable things, unethical things in the name of freedom and democracy. The US taking over another country and putting a dictatorship in place for every year from World War II to the present, which is kind of counterintuitive in terms of making the world safe for democracy, I think was Woodrow Wilson's oft quoted phrase. So realizing in real time that the people governing us are corrupt, seeing the tremendous wave of enthusiasm, which I hope carries forward for Joe Biden, and his executive orders yesterday were right on the money, bless him. But is it possible to govern ethically? And, you raise a point which for me is fascinating, that it used to be, and you're studying philosophy, it used to be that if you're going to study philosophy, you'd have to spend the first several hours with the epistemology, working out what are the terms that we're going to use, what do they mean precisely. I remember tuning into a radio program when I was about 40 years ago, and on Radio 4, and it was 4 philosophers having a conversation, and one of them said, I think before we go ahead, we should actually work out whether we're really here. And they then spend the whole program talking about whether they were there or not. And you really want to go and slap people like that. But that kind of discussion of what the words mean, what the facts are, has now, perhaps through postmodernism, it's pervaded society, so that yeah, people, it seems that people don't understand how to assess facts. I think if perhaps the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, which I've talked about elsewhere, they in 1938 in the US put forward this list of, I think it's 8 things, starting with glittering generalities that you will find that are propagandist, that they're ways of tricking people. So all politicians go, well, we people in the room are the best people in the world. You know, you people I'm talking to are really the most wonderful people ever. The glittering generality. Here we go. Right. This person is a liar or politician, you know, not necessarily that much difference, sadly. So there are ways of at least sorting out the worst excesses. And there are ways of teaching people to understand better how to assess information. You know, Photoshop. I remember when you were a kid and Sam started believing that there were, was it 8-legged dogs? He had this real fear that he'd seen this picture of an 8-legged dog. And it took a little while to settle him down and go, no, this is The Simpsons. It's a cartoon, mate. It's not actually real. And even if it were, what's to worry about, you know? But we seem to be living in a new medieval time, that demons and, you know, black cats and flying on broomsticks and has come back to us. And maybe that's partly because we just cannot get rid of magical thinking. You know, people want there to be something that's directing all of this. They want there to be a meaning, a purpose that's beyond the meaning we as human beings construct, you know, something everlasting, some heavenly design. So that we find that when surveyed, even over 70% of atheists believe in magic, which is fine. You know, I don't believe in God, but I do believe in Santa. You know, it's like, okay. Yeah. So, you know, I think it's a struggle on an individual level of teaching people, if we can, or helping people to better filter their information.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just cannot be done. And it's a responsibility the education system has completely ignored since the death of rhetoric in the 1950s in the syllabus. Analysis of information, evaluation of information, it's just not taught anymore. And it does lead us to a place where Sting, in you know, that great philosopher, said he didn't believe our politicians. They all look like game show hosts to me. And then Donald Trump, who was a game show host pretty much, became president. And you realize that it's like Walt Disney has taken the world over, and that nightmare in which Disney really lived. So that, you know, and all the cocaine that kept him going, and his anti-Semitism and his pro-Hitler stance, you know, these kind of things that were floating around back there, and his loathing of women. But no, it's all right, it's fine. It's all the Aristocats, or, you know, Toy Story 3 or what have you. We're kind of living the dream, if you like, and that's not actually a good thing to do. You know, that reality is, especially in this time when everybody's walking around in masks. Very strange.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably like the big thing that was labelled as like the postmodern condition was the breakdown of meta-narratives, right? So all the narratives of history have sort of fallen apart a bit now, which I think is probably accurate. You can sort of read postmodern philosophy as analysis or diagnosis. It's quite interesting that you can sort of, because as analysis, I think it's pretty accurate, quite a lot of it.
As diagnosis, oh no.
Yeah. It's sort of like starting with the assumption that things have gone wrong and then trying to build something from there, which is actually there's like the two approaches, right? You know, conventional optimism tends to be things as they are now can continue, we just need to tweak things. Whereas pessimism is actually, well, I mean, I don't know, I believe there's a lot of value to pessimism, which pessimism can be. Things are really broken, but if we accept this, we can build something on top of this. But that's obviously very dangerous as well, which is why pessimism rightly should be treated with a lot of skepticism.
Should skepticism be treated with a lot of pessimism, though?
Probably, yeah.
I tend to think that both optimism and pessimism are admissions of having an unreal perception of reality, so they're wrong, and to be realistic is best. And that the old adage, expect the best, prepare for the worst. I think you have it with skepticism that is the one flame that we need to keep burning, that we need to keep questioning our own assumptions, which is the hardest thing to do. And occurs only by doing what we're doing now, by having dialogue with somebody else who hopefully will have a slightly different idea and will have different information and interpretation. And I think by moving that forward, we can get somewhere. The idea that history's been written about the wrong things, it is the history of thuggery or warfare, as it's also known, that's still predominates. Agincourt happened in 1415. In 1066, Britain was invaded. In 19 these ideas of the warrior culture is really the prime thing. Then you get the history of capitalism, and there's the Fuggers and the Medici and these people that created the next phase after the thugs had take the bullying chieftain thugs had taken over, and their kids had inherited and kept their place by being bullying thugs. You then got mercantile capitalism, and then you got the myth of the nation, this wonderful idea that you belong to a set of people, and as long as you did, there's a great film by Joseph Lucy called King and Country about the First World War, with I think Tom Courtenay playing the lead. And it's just a regular guy who's gone out there, with all the parades and all of the rah-rah, and we're going to get the Bosch, the Huns, we're going to get rid of them, the squareheads, all of that. And then he finds himself in the trenches. And when he's asked why he's there, the answer is for king and country. Well, one of those things is an abstraction that doesn't exist. There is no such thing as a country. There's a collection of people. In America, are Republicans patriotic on behalf of Democrats? Are Democrats patriotic on behalf of Republicans? Or are they, in fact, really not patriotic at all? They want to exterminate half of the population so that they can be right. But that then becomes that fiction. Then eventually you get things like mass observation in the 1930s, where history is actually about the everyday things. It's actually about what people think and say, and how they do their daily grind. We still have this expression. Imagine that people used to spend an hour a day grinding corn on a stone so that they could have their daily bread. And we still talk about the daily grind, and I think most people don't really realize, they had to walk however many miles to a pump to get water and all of this stuff. We've come to a place where I'm not sure. Yeah, was it Kant who said that there's the universe out there and there's the universe in here, that basically and ne'er the twain shall, or rarely the twain shall meet, that we live in our own construction of the universe, and that's okay. That I don't see that we can ever change that, but we could have a more realistic construction of what's happening in the world. We live in an age of, Auden called the 20th century the age of anxiety. I think the 21st century is the age of paranoia. I think we've gone a step beyond. So there is this, we need to be skeptical, but our skepticism becomes suspicion. So Joe Biden will have a neoliberal agenda. Oh dear. That's not going to solve the problems. Making sure that you tick all the boxes, fill all the forms, observe everything statistically, hasn't really worked in education. We're seeing, actually, I think, a collapse in education, which has been going on for decades, where students come out with less and less ability to deal with the world, to do something about the world, and more ability to spout information that's probably about 20 years out of date, in my experience of the way that, say, psychology is taught at the moment. Where does that take us, though? What happens next? What's the diagnosis moving away from the postmodern view? where are we actually going to go in the next 10 years, do you think?
Well, this is the part that worries me, right? Because I agree that we need to sort of hone and sharpen our analytical and rational skills. I think one of the biggest crimes in education is we don't teach critical thinking in any respect at all, really. We you know, we teach subjects, which I think is a big mistake. We should really move away from teaching subjects and move into teaching ways of thinking, not to sound too sinister. I mean that in sort of in a critical sense, and that would be interesting. You know, firstly, people would be much more interested to talk to, and you know, and but secondly, you know, we wouldn't have maybe the same problems. Though the worry that I suppose I have is that obviously the amount of strain, intellectual strain, you have to put someone under to justify and legitimize every one of their beliefs is incredibly high. So if I want to form a worldview, right, and I want to keep up with today information in the news, I have to take some things on their face, because I can't go to the Middle East and explore the events firsthand. You know, same thing with history. I can't. I can read a book about history, but then finding the actual sources, studying them firsthand, learning the language to read the source firsthand, you know, is a lot of work. And then at the same time, I have to become a scientist, and you know, so there is a sense in which the amount of epistemic effort you have to put into these things is incredibly high. And then what I think we're seeing is we're seeing not just here we have, you know, not just like sort of a weak form of two narratives forming. We actually have scientists, you know, or people, you know, who we believe to be misguided, and I probably think they are misguided. Though I can't speak with enough academic authority in this area. That's the thing. They have they have scientists, you know, they have physicians, they have you know, historical so-called scholars, though those are actually somehow easier to root out in some ways. They have this wealth of their own academics, their own intellectuals, their own sources, their own media resources they rely on. And at the cost of going, you know, the BBC is, you know, all of its fake news, all the stuff on all mainstream media is fake news. And I suppose at that point, like, how do we shift people's perceptions from one of those camps of beliefs where they keep a certain group of intellectual and academics to another camp of beliefs? Or actually, how do we remove this distinction again that's sort of very much formed? It's like rising something that happened recently that I thought was quite interesting was that I don't know if you probably know who Sam Harris is, you know, classic, one of the four horsemen, which is the most embarrassing title they could have ever picked. But he recently severed his connections to, because he was sort of in with the pro-Trump crew of academics for a while, and recently he severed them off completely, saying, you know, because he was always against Trump, and he finally sort of made a pretty brave move. But then I sort of thought, we're forming a real clear divide here now. It's like a line's being drawn in the sand, and it's not between 0.1% or 0.01%, which actually is destructive enough of your population. It's more like a good 10%, possibly more, because lots of people voted for Trump in America, and lots of people in Britain will even probably back Trump, given them putting in the same situation.
Well, I mean, QAnon is reckoned to have 3 million followers on Facebook in 71 countries in the world. And, you know, this is the capital invasion crew. These are the people that believe that the swamp is being drained, and, you know, the cabal of Democrats are keeping slave children to extract adrenochrome from them. I'm told that was invented by Anthony Burgess, by the way, in Clockwork Orange, adrenochrome, because I first heard of it from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, but somebody corrected me and said, no, it's in Clockwork Orange. But it's an invention nonetheless. I think in the US, what we've seen, Noam Chomsky with whom I don't always agree, but he's what a smart bloke. He put forward the propaganda model, this idea that you don't have to control the media will control itself. And they did, column inches for what had happened with Solidarność, Solidarity in Poland, and at the same time, how much reporting there was of that, which was a mass, and at the same time, how much reporting there was of Nicaragua. And the point was basically that the Catholic Church was profoundly involved in both of these things. There were 6 Catholic priests in the Sandinista government. All of them were excommunicated for practicing liberation theology and trying to get involved with politics. Meanwhile, in Poland, of course, the Pope being Polish, the driving force between Solidarity was the Catholic Church. So liberation theology was okay there, but not there. But what Chomsky just looked at how many column inches. The other one was the East Timor compared to Cambodia, and looking at how much reporting there was. And it simply seemed that where there were strong American corporate interests, there was no reporting. And it wasn't that Murdoch and Maxwell were saying, you can't do this. It was that the culture was, it's kind of groupthink, that we're not going to do that. In the States, we saw the takeover of the radio stations, particularly. It's been estimated that 90% of US radio is controlled by what is called the right. I don't think America have the vaguest idea what the terms left and right in politics mean. They have 2 center-right political parties, and that's it. There aren't any socialists involved, except for Bernie Sanders, obviously. But there they are with this conception of what it is, to be a proper human being, that has all of these terms, all of these exclusions. Libtard is a favorite of mine. I tried repturd for a while, but nobody, it's a horrible word. Nobody should use it. But it degenerates into the hurling of brickbats into insults rather than the investigation of material. And that throws us right into my subject matter, which is fundamentally cognitive dissonance, if you like. That how do you get people to get past their confirmation bias, their my side bias, their, what I know is what's true, and what you're saying disagrees with it, therefore it isn't true. Why aren't we, this is the most tested hypothesis in all of psychology. There have been more experiments, tens of thousands, supporting cognitive dissonance, the simple idea that if you give me evidence against my beliefs, I will believe more strongly, not less. And that is human nature. But why isn't that taught in schools? It was first proposed by Festinger, I think, in 1953, his first paper. And here we are, all these years later, with this simple idea that if something makes me feel annoyed, I need to look at it. So in the States, we got Rush Limbaugh, we got Fox News. There's a great documentary called The Brainwashing of My Dad, which I think is on YouTube, where basically this lovely old bloke has been completely saturated by right-wing news, and has come to believe all of this nonsense that's invented, quite evidently invented by Rush Limbaugh. You don't need much of a fact checker to cut your way through that absolute abject nonsense. But you can, this guy becomes a raging old maniac. During the course of the program, we find out about somebody who, because she said she liked something that Barack Obama had said, her own father, determined that he would never speak to her again. And this has got a little bit silly, hasn't it? It's time we sat down, calmed down, had a cup of tea, or coffee if you're American. No, that's actually a bit more of a stimulant. And maybe some mate tea or something, some mint tea or something, and chilled out about all of this and thought about where we're headed and where it's going to take us, because where we're headed at the moment is civil war. Where we're headed at the moment, and at the moment it's just an intellectual civil war, but people are being killed as a consequence. in small numbers so far. If we don't, and I think it's really simple to bring about critical thinking. I don't think it's that complicated. I think it's a matter of starting early enough and allowing kids to express opinions and encouraging them to express opinions and encouraging them to say, I don't understand, or I don't want to do that because I don't think it's a good idea. All of the obedience training, Oscar Wilde said that obedience was man's original sin, man's original mistake. It's the fundamental problem that we have, because the thought is that if people aren't, it's like believing whether, Carl Rogers said to Martin Buber in a conversation, he said, I think you'd agree with me, Martin, that man is basically good. And Martin Buber, being somewhat more rational than Carl Rogers, said, yes, I would agree. Man is basically good and evil. And I see people who want to compress us into one or the other. We're all good, so do what you like, or we're all evil, so everybody has to be controlled. And I think the truth is there are a very small number of people in our society who need to be controlled, and they're called psychopaths. There are people who need to be kept away from power, and we're not doing anything about that. The thought that a game show host who was actually a bankrupt, who was actually a failed businessman, whose sense of business acumen was such that he thought that putting 3 casinos in the same place would be a good idea. So who's your chief competitor? Who's taking your business away? It's like, and this is the art of the deal? Oh, no.
There's all these casinos popping up around. What's going on?
Yeah. Like, you don't have to have them all in Atlantic City. You could have one in Las Vegas and one in Reno, and they probably would be profitable, but he hadn't worked that out.
No. I don't mind them going bankrupt by themselves, to be fair, but yeah.
No, it's an awful business altogether. That the whole idea of gambling and what it does to people, really terrible stupidity. But heck, human nature. But I think if my friend Arachelov calls it intelligent disobedience. I keep talking about his wonderful little book about that, because you can apply it to kids. And what you say about not separating out into subjects, the old, where Greek philosophy is, that you have philosophy and natural philosophy. So that's it. Everything fits into that. It all fits together neatly. There is no super distinction between chemistry, physics, and biology. There is science. And where you start going off on separate routes, you get non-science or nonsense. And strange disciplines like sociology, that's an interesting one. They talk about new religious movements, and they are one within their own definition, which was put forward, I think, by Brian Wilson originally, and then further refined by Gordon Melton. Two gentlemen who I have absolutely very little respect for. They put forward this idea that we've got to treat all groups as new religious movements, whether they're religious at all. I mean, according to Wilson's criteria, the Manson family was a religion. I went through it and checked, and hey, it's a religion. He was actually looking at Scientology, which I know something about. And the Manson family scored higher on Wilson's criteria for religion than Scientology did, though he was saying Scientology is a religion.
Well done on them.
Yeah, but I think that, rather than just being sensible and talking about belief systems, it comes into this thing of what's the language we're using and what does it mean? And do we have any agreement on what these terms mean? When I say SARS-CoV-2, somebody else may say hoax. For me, it's a kind of observable reality that as the Chinese and the Russians and the British and the Americans all have their own vaccines, there is no Bill Gates sitting behind all of these vaccines, because if you had that much power, you'd just put people into the slaughterhouse and get rid of the ones you didn't like. You wouldn't have to waste time with all this fiddle with vaccines,
It's very inefficient. It's very, very poorly executed. The globalists are incredibly bad at this whole global conspiracy thing.
They are
very, very bad at it. It always strikes me that they're so bad at they're so so powerful, and yet they get caught in a pizzeria, with all the children in the basement.
But my friend Yuval Law was talking about the Bible, and he said, you get to the plagues of Egypt, and you go, well, why didn't God just tell Pharaoh, let my people go? Would have been easy. God could just say, stop it, and that would be that. Boils and frogs and the firstborn and all that. It's such a lot of effort. If you are all powerful, you just frighten the living daylights out of him, and he lets them go. Of course, we also have a bit of a problem, which is historically, the Jewish people were never in Egypt. There was no Egyptian slavery, because the Egyptians, bless them, kept records of everything, and there would have been a record. But they did, however, this is an interesting point, in the second book of Kings, we find, and we can date this, it's I think 621 BC, 622, somewhere around there. Josiah, the king, is told that they've been worshipping the wrong gods. It's right there in the Bible. We've been worshipping the wrong gods, and they pull down all the shrines, and they find the book of the law, which is probably the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And then the next step in creating, the history of the Jewish people begins. And the funny thing is, we know about the date of this because Josiah, who brought the worship of the one God back and overthrew the worship of Asherah, the mother goddess, who was in fact the mother of Jehovah, but we don't mention that because it's not really safe. We know about him because the Egyptians killed him, and that was his reward for bringing back the true religion. So I'm not sure that it's actually not until Ezra that you get modern Judaism after the Babylonian captivity, which did happen. So it's but we create a mythology, we create a background out of which to believe, so that we can then offend other people. And at the moment, we have the mythology of the South, for example, in the United States. The idea, they bring forward the Confederate battle flag, most of them not realizing that it's not actually the Confederate flag. And the reason there is a Confederate battle flag is because the Confederate flag looks too much like the Union flag. So they had to have another flag when they were fighting. But this notion that, this fake history of, slaves liked being slaves, and it's best for them because they're a separate species from the rest of us. It's like, oh yeah,
get those sort of also these commentators who are themselves, African American, black and stuff, and they'll go there and they go, yeah, this is right. My great grandma actually had a great friendship with a KKK member, and you go, that's such poor evidence. But then because it's all about appearances now, that really flies for some people now.
Yeah. I mean, the most shocking images I've seen outside of photographs of Belsen, for example, which did happen. My father was there. So I have direct evidence. My father was in the force that liberated Belsen. So when people say no Holocaust, it's like, no. But the worst images I've seen were of the backs of slaves, black slaves, who'd been whipped, and it makes me weep. And a group of white folks, this was a photograph taken in the 1920s in the United States, in the Deep South, of a group of happy white people drinking beer and celebrating. And in the foreground, there is the barbecued remains of a black man on a pit. And the idea that he enjoyed that is just beyond me, that people could be so asinine. But a folklore is created about the division between North and South, about nation, about race. Even that we use the word genocide, that wonderful 20th century word, which presumes it is the killing of a genus. So it already presumes that we are separate races in some way. So the word itself is bogus. The genetic evidence is reasonably good now that we do derive from a single origin in Africa. And so the reality is some of us are more black than others. And that's the only difference, really, that sexual selection in different parts of the world has led to us having, different characteristics. and the ability to survive in different climates, you know, having a paler skin so you could get your vitamin D working a bit more, or what have you. But these tribes are created, and it's like watching Game of Thrones or, you know, the Lord of the Rings, that people are going, well, I'm Boromir and I belong to the humans, or I'm an elf, or, you know, I'm a hobbit, or all of this. And no, we're all actually part of the same material. And everything we have in the world now, this is the most prosperous time ever. The life that you and I lead is the easiest life ever. A king in the 19th century did not live as good a life as we lead. Certainly, if you go back to the 18th century, they definitely didn't. We have the medical stuff. We don't even think about it, that we're not, you know, when you look at infant mortality, just before Semmelweis taught people to wash their hands before delivering babies, you know, let's be logical. That my grandmother was one of 14 children, and they considered themselves lucky because 11 of them had survived childhood. And
Wow.
you think about the trauma of losing a child, and you think almost every family, you know, 150 years ago had experienced that trauma. So PTSD was an aspect of everyday life. We in the first world, you know, having rapaciously stolen all of the stuff from the rest of the world, we live in a time of great plenty, and we're letting it ebb away through our incredible greed and selfishness, that we believe that recycling is going to do something. I mean, what a laugh, you know. Most of this country's recycled material is on the beaches in Turkey now, you know. It's like, so yeah, well, give us money, we'll take it from you, you know. We're in our landfill. So we see all sorts of crazy attitudes of mind, which are really about people focusing on the wrong things rather than being pro-human. You know, Charlie Chaplin's, you know, I'm a patriot for the whole world rather than any country. People divide up and join their little tribal cliques, their cults there, and then further the agenda of those things, almost incapable of thinking. You know, that it does worry me that, you know, I talked with a friend the other day in Los Angeles, and he said, I'm just not political. He said, I have friends are Democrats, I have friends are Republicans, and I don't believe any of them. You know, they've got their agenda, they're determined, and often they've got an ideal. Like Margaret Thatcher had I think she was an idealist, and that's the most dangerous kind of politician, you know, that she was going to this green and sceptred isle set in an emerald sea. She'd believed, you know, as Adam Curtis said, she'd believed the Churchill myth about a golden age of merry England, you know, which, you know, make America great again. It's that same thing. That time hasn't existed. What frustrates me is I think it could exist. I think we have all the tools to make a very habitable world, and they're not being properly used because of short-termism, because of corporate greed, and because possibly this is something that interests me, and it's got nothing to do with our conversation, really. There's a wonderful TV program about the compensation paid to slave owners. In 1838, David Olawayo, I think is his name, the historian, very good. In 1838, having finally said, okay, you know, the first anti-slavery act in this country was that you couldn't sell people. So the slave owners started breeding their slaves. So in 1834, it was ruled, you know, you couldn't have slaves. That was that. And in 1838, the British government paid out the largest compensation amount ever paid to the owners of the slaves. They did not pay a penny to the slaves themselves. And the thought is that the people who have power and money in our society today are mainly the descendants of the slave owners. Now that bothers me. You know, a black person being upset with a white person saying white people did this to me, Well, the response is, I'm really sorry to say, but you almost inevitably have a slave owner in your genes because of the disgusting practices of slave owners. So the black population, I'm afraid, were raped. I probably don't have the genes of a slave owner, so it's nothing to do with me, mate. But the argument goes beyond that, that, you know, we can't divide ourselves in this way. We can't say, because we have to, you know, we have to have a common enemy, and the common enemy is that which is harmful to humanity. People, and climate change is a part of that, understanding the environment's a part of that. But I think the main thing is irrationality and brutality, you know, the idea of perpetuating a society because my great-great-grandparents grew rich on the sugar trade by keeping slaves, therefore I should have power today. And I'm starting to sound like a revolutionary Marxist. Yeah, let's do them all.
Well, the thing, this is the issue with all the dangerous ideas. They've all got a point. I mean, you know, this is the issue with. This is what I've always thought about Marxism. I mean, as someone who found a £3 collected works of the Lenin book, which was one of my proudest finds because it was very cheap for what was quite a sizable tome. You know, and having read some of it, and having gone, some of this is good, some of this is, ooh, we'll stay away from that. He was very clearly a very intelligent man, which is the thing that always strikes me about the communists. Is that even as terrible as they get, well, perhaps maybe excluding Stalin, because Stalin clearly didn't have a very good engagement with culture.
He was a poet, though, as a young man.
Yeah, and very good looking.
And he was a great mate of Pavlov's. It said that Pavlov was the only person who was allowed to be rude to Stalin because he revered him, because he thought he had the secrets of the control of the human mind.
But yeah, Lenin wrote, what was it, Imperialism is the highest form of capitalism, which is actually quite a smart little tract. And the issue is that it's very easy to move from that attitude, you know, that sort of, well, these corporate interests, these capitalists are the problem, and you go, okay, then now let's kill them. You know, that move is actually very bad. I don't think I have to say that, though actually these days you kind of do.
I agree with you. I think you do have to say that putting them up against the wall and shooting them isn't actually the solution. Probably doing something about inheritance, the very thing that Teddy Roosevelt so long ago tried to bust the trusts, tried to make it so they couldn't pass on incomes of hundreds of millions of dollars a year to individuals through trust funds. His distant cousin, FDR, again, with the New Deal, tried to bring about some equality where you've got to the point where single individuals can bend the will of governments. We are in trouble. We do not have a democracy. And, you know, problems in our society: corruption, deception, self-interest, that, and the wonderful mystical doctrine of the invisible hand. You know, it's like we believe in the magic of the free market. We are, however, subsidizing all of our farmers, but we do really believe in the gospel of the free market.
Oh, yes, this is the brilliant thing, isn't it? You know, the free market will work, and yet the free market has had so many breakdowns in the 20th century and 21st, and 21st century alone. 2008, and it looks like coronavirus is going to has already instigated another economic catastrophe.
Oh yeah.
At which point business has been propped up by the state, not by people, but by the state. And then all the Marxists, even the minor ones that in the world go, well, Marx was right, wasn't he? Now look at capitalism; it's all falling apart again. And then people go, no, it's fine. We can just start it back up by backing out the business. It's like when Bernie Sanders says it's socialism for the rich and rugged capitalism for the poor. It's quite accurate, unfortunately. And you get these strange situations now where you get like a right-wing libertarian talking to like a left-wing authoritarian, and they'll agree on something because they both go, these big companies are being supported by the government, and it starts to look a bit like corporatism, which is I don't want to go down. It's not quite fascism, but it shares some similarities and features.
Well, it's not democratic, and I think that is the problem that William Goodwin, the father of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, so the father of the mother of Frankenstein, he in the 18th century wrote, having spent his whole life trying to form an independent school and failing, a school for kids, independent school for kids. He wrote a tract which runs to about 800 pages or something, so I'm afraid I haven't managed it all. But I have read extracts from it, which thankfully somebody pulled out. And he talks about the law and why we have the law. And I had never considered this simple thing. He said the law exists to protect the rich. It then exists to protect the property of the rich. All the rest comes later. And he points out, as I think is pointed out in the movie K-Pax, when talking about alien societies, we don't need a legal code because everybody knows what's right and wrong. And there is, having engaged mightily with our legal system, I have understood that, as Lord Justice Wolfe said, in England, it is the case that he with the deepest pockets wins. And that's not really justice. Justice is the fundamental. Corruption is the opposite of justice. And we're living in a world where, when John Kerry was standing as president, I remember him having a marquee set up, and to go in and talk to him and shake his hand cost, I think it was $150,000. And preferment is, we're in a bad place. That we have to find some more ethical way of governance. And I think that probably means bringing in penalties for politicians. That if, the one I push for is that if a politician lies on the floor of whichever house they're in, Parliament, the Senate, wherever, then they should be banned from politics for a certain period of time. That should be that. Because the same way that a lawyer, when they go into court, they are under oath. They don't have to swear an oath. Everything they say to the judge, they can be got for perjury if they deceive a judge. And I think it should be the same. I think also they should have to clock in. When the expenses scandal happened, and we found, my MP was had the second highest expenses after the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown at the time. Ken Clarke had £110,000 that he'd managed to spend. How much of that was traveling the world for British American tobacco, of which he happened to be the vice president for a while? I don't know. But he wasn't one of the ones who got caught. He'd, signed.
It was all on Miles Davis albums, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that wild? That he's got a phenomenally good taste in jazz, but and was the only Tory MP to vote against the Iraq War. Has said many sensible things and pushed for many sensible things, but nonetheless spending a huge amount of money. When we got down to that and they have to declare their interests, I think they should clock in like regular working people so that we know how much time they spend in the Palace of Westminster and how much time they spend in the bar of the Palace of Westminster.
Transparency definitely needs to be increased. I mean, I think the thing that we need to see, this is going more into politics, but I am very opinionated in that. I think we probably need to localize politics as well. Again,
I agree. Power should be at the lowest level it needs to be to function. Pushing, the state, to the extent that it exists to defend people. The idea that the state can interfere with economics or should interfere with economics has proved to be astonishingly dangerous. Look at all those years of austerity that we suffered under David Cameron, to then lead us into a crisis where the only solution is a Keynesian solution, that you have to print money and hope. The problem being, of course, that Asia has not been hit. Asia acted sensibly about COVID-19. And so their economies are still functioning. And given how much China was annoyed, and I'm not a fan of Xi or the horrors of Xinjiang, it's absolutely awful what's being done to the Chinese people by its government. and it should never be thought of as China is this evil thing. The Chinese government is this evil thing. But unfortunately, the behavior of Barack Obama, followed by the behavior of Donald Trump, caused Chinese militarism. It caused them to say, these people are coming after us. We need to develop a military. And with the one road policy, they're basically making little stop-off points. They've got Sri Lanka now. The port and the airport both belong to the Chinese because they loaned them the money to do it, and then they couldn't pay the interest. So they've got stopping off points for the military. They've developed weapon systems which are possibly in advance of the US now, and their economy is stable. So, we've pushed ourselves into this corner now through the mistake of trading with a fascist nation. China, I think we can apply the term fascist, because where you only have one party that's standing in elections, you don't really have elections.
Yes.
And yet the West leapt in to trade with them and, gave everything.
We trusted Deng, didn't we? We trusted Deng, and it turned out that, Tiananmen Square happened.
And that didn't stop anybody and make them think. And the whole process of special economic zones where slaves could be hired by Marks and Spencer or, whoever wanted to, and they could PR their way out of it, and people go to Topshop and buy their Arcadian clothes, and they don't think for a moment about, the poor Chinese couple who will only see each other once a year, even though they both live in the same city. They will only see each other for a week of every year when they go back to see their one or now maybe two children. And,
it's
and I've got a new blouse from Topshop,
Yeah, it's like that ancient Japanese story about the two lovers that loved each other too much. They had to keep them apart. They could only meet once a year. Though obviously very different. I think I just flagged, though I think that's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about, which is that we like to talk a lot about ethical consumerism these days. Now, I'm actually a massive skeptic of that way of doing things. I actually don't think it's very useful. I think it's very dangerous, actually, in some ways, because I think on the one hand, obviously, it's correct. It's the right thing to do, right? We can avoid buying from companies that directly, for example, fund the Chinese government, which therefore funds the camps in Xinjiang. We should definitely try and stop that. Similarly, with certain animal products, definitely that's the case as well. Depending on your
shouldn't buy human organs from China either.
No. That's really. I don't have to say that's really bad. Everyone knows that.
Well, the Chinese government evidently don't. If you disagree with us politically, well, just harvest your organs and then you'll be fine.
Yeah. That's a new meaning to body without organs. I think it's like a Deleuzian phrase or something. Regardless, and we need to I think we need to do something about producers a little bit as well. We need to sort of go, no, actually, if you're using these things to produce your things, you should be punished as well. We shouldn't be just going to consumers, because there's an unreasonable, if you actually walk down a modern high street, you try and do ethical consumption, it's very difficult. It's almost impossible. And if you think too hard, you'll end up ruining yourself, because even if a supermarket sells an ethical product, it's not actually simple as you did an ethical thing, because then the supermarket will use that money to further its investments towards making profit in a different area. And this idea that we have expanding markets, this idea that, more people become this, and then the demand goes down, supply increases. The demand for something new increases and some supply for something else goes down, doesn't seem to really happen. Instead, what seems to happen is we just get new markets, new possibilities for finance and capital opening up. It doesn't look like we see a decline in industries as much as just the rise of new ones. Until people who are ethical consumers becomes a market you can sell to that are very stable. A certain class, you can aim for them, where they live, what sort of things they like, they are into indie music, and they, wear Doc Marten shoes.
It was said that Cambridge Analytica had 5,000 data points, pieces of information about everyone over the age of 18 in the United States. 5,000 pieces of information. So that goes even further than your shoe size and what you drink at Starbucks. And from there, thankfully, they use the ocean system of profiling, which is a complete nonsense. It's like the KGB, you know, they'd got all of the information from all of the intelligence agencies in the world, but they didn't have the time to go through it because they were so good at collecting it. And they were always killing one another because of, you know, the paranoia that this, but just, we do live in an astonishing world. And you can't, I mean, 40 years ago, I started working on this piece in my head about, you know, ethical consumption, and saying, well, you can't buy from South Africa because of this, you can't buy from Israel because of this. And so first we clicked off that list, then you started looking at the companies themselves and what they did and how they treated people. Anybody that was using a special economic zone, so Nike, Alan Sugar, the great Alan Sugar, Amstrad, he was the first person to go to Indonesia after the genocide, which made it possible to manufacture goods cheaply. You know, I think, you know, to me, there's this, what seemed, and again, this has been in my mind since the 1970s, that as we automate industry, there will never be full employment. Full employment, there never has been, except when there have been wars. There never will be full employment. You have to look towards a society where the unemployed are not considered to be pariahs. Mm-hmm. And you have to find something for people to do so that they won't become alcoholics, junkies, or Trump support, or go crazy. And so it seems to me that schools should be teaching craft. Seems a silly, simple idea, but you teach all sorts of crafts, and then you don't have to, you know, you can sit at home weaving your own cloth from the sheep you've got on your lawn or what have you. But there has to be a more integrated view of how we are going to survive as a social being, you know, how we're going to, and that will mean more education, but actual education, teaching people how to evaluate and understand, teaching people how to communicate. Why isn't that taught in our schools? The fundamentals of communication. And why are school teachers such children, so many of them? Why is it that they manage to get into teaching without ever growing up? And I speak of, I've got 4 kids, seeing them through school. I've been astonished at the kind of level of maturity that I've met in many teachers. Why isn't teaching fun? Teaching should be great fun, should be stimulating kids to think stuff and do stuff, and, you know, be like the Scandinavians, spend half the time out of doors poking beetles and, you know, looking in chrysalids and, you know, engaging with the world, rather than the idea that school is going to be this horrifically tedious experience that will waste the best years of your life.
Yeah. Oh God. I mean, yeah, I will never forget the point when me and my friends were actually interested in being taught and learning, you know, because, and I've always, you know, had a thing with education. I think it's probably because it's the thing I've been in so far, right? And because I have experience of it, plus my interest in changing things, it's always been the thing I've hammered against. Also because I think it is literally foundational. And I remember someone just saying, why are you debating it? We're just here to get grades and forget everything. It's like, ooh, you know. No, I think it was actually, when we're here to get grades, not to learn. And it's like, this is a surreal moment, you know, when you have a kid in a school, we're not here to learn. And you get teachers expressing the same sentiment, good ones, you know, really good teachers saying the same things, you know, because I was quite lucky. I had quite a lot of good teachers. So I went to one of the last remaining grammar schools, which now I'm not a big fan of grammar schools as a concept, but back then I was a young child. I was like, oh, this is good. And I will say I've benefited from it. But you'd have teachers there going, yeah, well, I mean, we're not here to really teach you things. We're here to get you through the exam. And so the good teacher would sort of get the syllabus done in about half a year, and then they teach what they want to teach in the other half a year. I think the other issue is that unfortunately lots of teachers are sort of, and I don't want to be brutal here, but they are the people who didn't succeed in their respective field.
Those who can do, those who can't teach. D.H. Lawrence.
That's not how it should be. It's not how it should be.
The teachers should be the best people in the society because they have the most important job.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think one major thing that happened is that as women began to be able to get jobs elsewhere, it used to be that if you were a smart woman, you'd be a school teacher. That was the best you could hope for. You couldn't be a doctor. That was going to be highly unlikely, let alone a lawyer or anything like that. And so that quality has changed. So I can remember, you know, the most intelligent women who taught me at primary school were incredibly embittered. They didn't want to be there doing it. So it wasn't very helpful. But there's also the lack of respect for teachers, the poor pay for teachers, the numbers that you're always going to have too many kids to actually cope with, almost always. But also it's going to be deathly boring because of the national curriculum. You are going to actually be teaching the same thing every year.
Oh.
And it's sort of you know, it's as if somebody decided to drown our society. And I again and again and again with Sam and with Dan, because they both had trouble at school because of their sleep disorder. So we had years of talking to psychologists and teachers, and the most common phrase from all of them was, "You have to jump through the hoops." And I remember I sat there in a room with 4 teachers and a psychologist at some point, and I just looked at them and said, "But isn't this about to be education? Don't any of you actually care about that?" And there was a deathly silence. No, you've got to jump through the hoops because eventually you'll be able to be educated. And I'm kind of going, look, for me, firstly, the responsibility for education is mine, my children. It's not up to the state to educate my children. The state should facilitate their education. But if it goes wrong, it's my fault, you know. And I did a fair amount of home education, not necessarily very well, but at least I have 4 children who are capable of having a discussion. They're capable of asserting their point of view. They're absolutely capable from the first of disagreeing with me, which is something that most parents don't seem to get. You know, that to empower a child, they have to have the locus of control in themselves. They have to be able to say, what you just said was not right. I don't think that's right. And, you know, very infrequently they are right. And I've made a mistake, you know, but no, actually far too often they're right. But giving that sense, and also giving the sense that being found to have made a mistake is okay. You know, the dare to be bad, as Rossetti told his working class students. The important aspect of art: be willing to make mistakes, and don't be ashamed. Don't be shamed by it, and don't shame people for it. I mean, I was told, my partner told me that school teachers now have this thing, pip rip, praise in public, reprimand in private, because I was complaining about this policy of humiliating and abasing people in front of others and how unhelpful it is. I had a friend who's a counselor in Los Angeles. She had an adult class and she said, write down one time you were discouraged at school and one time you were encouraged. And I don't remember it was just most or all of the class. Nobody could remember in their 13 years of school ever being encouraged. And it's all the wrong way around. It should be about increasing curiosity, not killing it.
Yeah. You actually reminded me, because I did a circle in my head just then. That one of the things I thought, well, it's interesting at the moment because I've just started new semester, started learning about ancient Greek philosophy, and I have this feeling it's going to be my favourite thing because of 2 things. One, they're wrong. They're completely wrong, especially the pre-Socratics about the way the world's formed. Then secondly, they're so incredibly intelligent.
Yeah.
There's a sense of someone who went into the world, who looked at things and tried really hard to come to some conclusions about the world. And in a sense, actually, they're more satisfying immediately than the more developed philosophers, because the more developed philosophers have read everything before them. So they sort of start with like standing on the shoulders of giants, Newton quote, right? But with these people, you can sort of see like they are like children in that sense, you know.
But by ancient Greek, do you mean the pre-classical period where you're looking at Pythagoras and people?
Yeah, Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes of the Malaysian school. And they construct these really interesting ideas about, well, for example, one of them was about the question was, why does the world stay in place? Like, why does the Earth just sit and seem to be stationary? Which is obviously wrong. That question has already got a problem to it. And this one, I think Anaximander went, well, I can't really conceptualize this place going up or down, and eventually sort of got to this view where there are forces acting on it in opposite and equal ways at all times, keeping it in the center of the universe. I was like, that, and he did it from just looking at things like that's very impressive. That's very impressive. It's not right, but it's, you know, it's something which is just so ingenious. And I think if we almost could teach children not to get things right, but to teach children to think in that way, right? And to think in the way of going, how do I understand X or Y or this thing? You know, how can I actually apprehend the nature of the things around me, using purely what I can see, what I can observe, what I can touch, what I can feel. Obviously, later on, you introduce more information. So obviously, we've got a lot to work with already that we've already done. But if we can get children in schools to think with that level of clarity and precision, and in creativity and inventiveness, I think we'll be looking at a better future, substantially. And this is always hampered by something which we can't really avoid, which is the fact that society will necessarily enforce its way of viewing things onto people, whether we like it or not, right? You can try and keep them off television, but then it'll be in the street. You can try and keep them off the street. I mean, the only way of doing it is by putting a child in a box, in a dark box, and making sure they never come out. And that's got its own problems, as we can probably, we've worked out by now, that's not actually the best.
B.F. Skinner's daughter said she actually had a very nice childhood. Skinner box or no. I think you're absolutely right. And I think the other part of that is if you teach kids that their opinion matters, the Matthew Lipman Socrates for 6-year-olds program, which has been with us for 40 years now, shows this. It demonstrates it profoundly, that rather than teaching children, you facilitate debate. And so you don't tell them, no, you're wrong about that. The one I remember from the TV show, which is called Socrates for 6-year-olds, and which I often refer to, is they're a group of 6-year-old kids. They're on average 6 months behind, according to the wonderful modern ways of testing children, which are all bogus. And for, I think, 6 months or something, they have this class where this poor guy who's just graduated from the program, so he's doing it for the first time, and he sat there, and the question he asks is, do we need a brain? And they have a circle of kids around him. They start with the kid to the left of him. Every kid gets to express an opinion. Nobody gets to sneer at anybody, but they do say, when the question is passed to them, whether they agree or disagree with the person who just spoke. So you got this wonderful conversation, do we need a brain? And this child is saying, well, I disagree with Peter because I think if we didn't have a brain, we'd fall over. And there was something, then seeing that applied to 15-year-old latchkey kids, all of them expected to become pimps, hoes, or drug dealers at 16 and be gone. Seeing them go through this program and start from being kind of sullen and, I don't want to be in this stupid room, to being totally engaged and enlivened in conversation and debate. What would happen if you went home and told your mum you're pregnant? Let's have a conversation about that. Every child in that class, and it was the school of last resort in New Jersey. There were 3 schools you could be expelled from before it. You expelled from that, there was nowhere to go. None of them was expected to go to senior high. Every kid in that class went to senior high. Nothing to do with learning mathematics or geography, all to do with engaging and being allowed to talk. Now, you see, what I think is that the balance in society is one of authoritarianism. People who believe that they, as bullies, should be worshipped and in charge, not naming any names, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Modi, and the people who believe, Abe as well, people who believe that they have to be told what to do, and that balance. Schopenhauer talks about it, 60%. Milgram finds it, 62.5%. Erich Fromm talks about it, 60%. For some reason, they all come in around this number. And you go, well, that's an easy number to push. If we could push it down to 48%, then society would change. People would become more engaged. And that is to do with 5-year-olds. That's to do with changing the way that we approach children. And doing exactly what you say, getting them to engage. And just through that, through being able to assert themselves, those authoritarian relationships, and we are changing. Our society is less compliant than the society that Solomon Asch and Milgram tested in the 50s and 60s. There is a little bit less compliance than there used to be. When World War I started, millions marched onto the trains to go and be slaughtered and get trench foot and all of that kind of stuff. When the Iraq War was about to kick off under Tony Blair, 1 million people marched and said, "Not in my name." Now, we do have the America First movement of the 30s to look back at. I'm not saying it's all, necessary. I thought it was so funny when Donald Trump started talking about America First with no knowledge of historically what the America First movement had been. It's like when people talk about the American way and they don't realize it's a slogan from the National Association of Manufacturers. It used to be on billboards, and it was a slogan that was brought forward to destroy the New Deal. Corporate America spent millions stopping the New Deal, and ultimately World War II succeeded in stopping it, sadly. But to get kids, enough kids going, no, I have a right to be human. I have a right to an opinion, and I don't. After I left Scientology, which is a long time ago, 1983, the first thing I got to is I don't want to agree with anybody completely ever again. And whenever I read something, I want to find something I disagree with. I want to maintain my individuality. And it's usually pretty easy to do, I must say.
Everyone's wrong about something.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sorting out those bits that seem right. It's like, I know, for example, that Galileo was a cheat. I know that Newton was a cheat. The statistical analysis absolutely proves these guys made up results for experiments. The Principia, the results tables in the 3 editions get better and better without Newton doing any more work. Does that mean I'm now going to say, well, the law of gravity, thermodynamics, let's forget about that? No, it doesn't. That doesn't matter. It's what is relevant and important, rather than this kind of. I had a friend who he wouldn't read Warrant for Genocide, Norman Cohen's remarkable deconstruction of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He wouldn't read it because Cohen, well, that's a Jewish name, isn't it? It's like, oh no.
Never listened to another Cohen album as well, then.
No, well, I can see the point in that, frankly, because he was Canadian, but.
Oh no, that makes sense. Actually, you put it that way.
I spent 3 days with Suzanne, actually, the famous Suzanne of the song. That's one of my celebrated moments. She was very interesting.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite Leonard Cohen songs. That's quite.
Her name is Suzanne Verdal.
Really?
Yeah. And she was working as an assistant to a guy who went to school with Leonard Cohen, who was making a documentary. This was 88. I was in Montreal, and this guy, leaving the airport. It's a long drive from the airport to the city of Montreal. I've been told by a friend in LA, he actually works for Scientology and he's going to kill you. So I was like, oh no, we're going in the middle of the night. And he said, do you know the Leonard Cohen song, Suzanne? I said, yes. He said, she's my assistant. So,
wow.
Yeah. And I did see a photo of her when around the time she'd known Cohen, and she was overwhelmingly beautiful. She's a flamenco dancer, really quite something when she danced. But there you go. See, even Canadian people are not dismissed in our scheme of things.
Yeah, this reminds me of one of the phrases that I was not peddling. I don't like that term, but one of the phrases that I was thinking, I thought this sums up how I'd like things to happen. Whether they will, different question. But it was generous confrontations. We need to have generous confrontations with people. Because I sort of saw this attitude emerging. This also came from observing, because I do harp on about the right, but I also do hate, not hate, dislike massive sway to the left. And it came from observing what people on the left would do with stuff which was now problematic. Now, I think what's healthy to do with things that are problematic, and this is even with people who are frauds and terrible, people who write bad things, is obviously we don't read them generically. Right? We don't just read them and go, don't give any more context, I think, right? But there's also this view that we should just throw these things out. These things aren't important anymore. These things aren't relevant to be looked at anymore. Whereas I think the thing to do is I've been telling people this is a Wittgenstein quote because I'm 100% sure I've read it. However, I can't find it again. So it's a bit worrying. But there was a quote that, so I'll attribute it to Wittgenstein very tentatively, but no one hold my feet to the fire on this one. He said about a book that was incredibly wrong by anyone's account. He said, this book is absolutely perfect as long as you put a negation symbol in front of the entire thing. And that's more meaningful. Yeah, not this. But that's more meaningful than just going, this is wrong. That's going, this is so wrong that it's actually, if you flip things around, it's actually right. It's got all the reasoning intact. It's got all the structures that if you just swap your perspective, you get the right thing. And it's the same thing with people we disagree with in a sense, and things, or problematic texts and problematic ways of thinking about things. If you actually read these things and then you really, really think about these things, engage with them properly, I think you'll find lots of exciting ideas and lots of interesting things. It's like how lots of the most influential political philosophers of the last, 50, 60 years, a lot of them engaged with Carl Schmitt, right? Because say what you want about him, he was a very clever man who had some thoughts, and a lot of them are wrong, but that's the value of it. And it's this idea that we need to maintain the confrontation. We need to carry on disagreeing with people, right? When we say we should be, respectful or generous or charitable in conversation, it doesn't mean we should let people off the hook. Right? It's not saying don't ask people to back up their claims or stuff. I mean, there's a limit to where that's the case, right? So if you're at a dinner party, don't be like, where's your sources? I need your citation list, right? Which I think everyone's had that experience where you're having an argument with somebody in a social setting and they start asking you for sources and you go, well, I don't have them on me right now. I wasn't expecting to have this conversation today. I'm not
or they pull their phone out and go into go and prove you wrong, the swines. Which is something I've just had to get used to, that I mean, my boys, they're sat there with their phones and I say something, it's immediately terrible.
Instant fact check. There's a fact check's going on now,
yeah. But it's important that we understand that sometimes something appeals to us because it seems rational. It's a good story. It's a good argument. So Freud, who kept people entranced for so long with, I can remember first encountering Freud, I was about 14. And I just went, I've never fancied my mother. What are you talking about? And then you find out it was something you did when you were a year old, and now, so to me, from the outside looking at Freud, it's a made up story. And you then get into Frederick Kreuser's wonderful biography of Freud, or Anthony Storr's Feet of Clay many years ago. And you find out that he was a horrific human being. He was a narcissist by his own definition of that word, which is wrong, because narcissists don't love themselves. They don't love anybody. They don't know how to love, as Eric Fromm pointed out. So, but Freud was, if you want the narcissistic personality disorder, he had it. He stole things from people. None of the ideas are his own in the first place. And the claims he makes and the damage that he personally did, so when his surgeon friend, two people paid for Freud to live. Josef Breuer was the other. I get confused. I think it's Fleischer. There's Fleischer and Fleischer. But this guy was an eminent surgeon who'd kept lending money to Freud. And then he cut his thumb and it went wrong. and he was in terrible pain, became a morphine addict. And Freud, this is at the beginning of his career, Freud takes him on as a case. And Freud at this time he's written Über Coca, his paper about cocaine and how fantastic cocaine is. And two popes actually endorsed it in wine. It's good for you, Mariani wine. It won gold medals from the papacy. So don't knock cocaine. So Freud basically gives this guy cocaine, and he then within 2 weeks writes a paper saying how you can cure morphine addiction using cocaine. The guy went on for 7 years as a double addict on morphine and cocaine in total agony. And that's the evidentiary foundation of a piece of Freud. And there was never any more evidence than that. What fascinates me is the way that it seems like a rational construction, and so we believe it. Another example would be the Mendel-Dawkins idea of genetics, modularism, that Yuval Harari, his book Sapiens, has sold something like 1 million copies, and people are really, and it's actually all based upon a completely discredited idea within evolution, the idea that 100,000 years ago, 1 million years ago, whenever on the savannah, we developed modules out of which came our religious beliefs and all sorts of things, and that these things are fixed. And what are you going to do about it? Just the way I was born, finding that in fact epigenetics exists, that genes are not read-only, they can be written on today in your lifetime. But the story is so nice. Modularism sounds so great, so Scott Atran says, yeah, somebody sees a bush waving on the savannah and they go, there must be a God. And therefore we have a module in our brains that is the God module. And you go, yeah, well, that's, Hansel and Gretel was quite a good story too, but I don't
believe in
think it actually happened, Could just be me. I don't think the gingerbread house existed.
Well, I actually worship it regularly.
Yes. Well, one has to worship it, but that doesn't mean it exists.
That's actually that's a strange psychological effect. It's like Santa Claus. The parents don't believe it except when the children are around. The children don't believe it unless the parents are around.
My friend Chris Shelton was saying to me, maybe we should admit to our children that we lied to them about Santa, and that'd be a good way of starting to proof them up against all of the tricks and traps in the world. And I just sat there and I didn't dare say, I have 4 children. I never told any of them that Santa Claus existed, because to me, that's just a stupid idea. So I did a program at Christmas because I bought an elf cam from my local pharmacist when they're selling for £2. I thought, I've got to have one of these. So you can get your kids to believe they're under surveillance all the time. Excellent idea.
It's like the perfect, it's like when Foucault talks about the panopticon, and we just bring it into our own house. Santa Claus is the original one. It's not Jeremy Bentham that's the worry.
Let's watch everybody all the time so they're paranoid. Or God is watching you all the time. God knows everything you do. And thankfully, I was brought up in an Anglican household. That was never inflicted upon me. My mum was not that she was a nice person, so she didn't want me to go, yeah, God's watching what you're doing under the sheets, mate. But anyway, we've probably come to. I've got another call I'm going to have to make. God damn it! This is always such a pleasure. So let's. Do you have any parting shot that you would like to?
Parting shots. Just that I managed to write down about 5 things that we should discuss properly, formally, in another time. Including technology, which sort of wandered off into the distance and got a bit lost in the mist. And I will do proper reading for those ones, because there are actually certain people I want to bring in thinking wise. If that's interesting, of course.
That is interesting. I'm fascinated to all of our conversations, right from you being 6 years old, which wasn't very long ago, by the way. Have been fascinating. I'm just fascinated by the way you think about things, and you are a great deal more rational than most of the people I talk to. That you construct things, and you are curious and fascinated by the world, which resonates with me, because that's all I have. That I dropped out of school because it was boring, and I like to be interested. So there we are. Okay, well. we've got subject matter for more conversations. It's been a tremendous pleasure. This is my guest, Rio Harada-Parr, and I'm Jon Atack. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you.
Hi, Jon here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
I think if we didn't have a brain, we'd fall over.